Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. This week, I had one of our wonderful viewers send me an interesting email. They said something to the effect of, Big Sam, I just picked up a really neat Mosin. It was made by the Remington factory in 1918, but I didn't even know Remington made Mosins. Could you tell me anything more about this rifle? And I thought this was a really good topic for an interesting video. Now, a disclaimer here, this is not going to be a full coverage of the Remington or the American contracts, which really comprise Remington and New England Westinghouse. We will have a dedicated Legends Never Die episode on that, but it'll be a while before we get to that because we're still in the process of filming and preparing episode 1, so it'll be a little ways away. But for now, we're going to talk a little bit about Remingtons, and specifically Remingtons produced in 1918, which is what we're actually looking at here. So I have a rather slightly rough-looking example of what our viewer had sent me. This is also a 1918 Remington, so we can kind of use this as a visual aid. So first of all, why did Remington produce Mosins? That's a good question. And then the simple answer, without going too far down the rabbit hole, is basically during World War I, the United States was allied with Russia. And the Central Powers, primarily we can think of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were actually fighting a two-front war, where, well, the Germans were at least, because they were fighting both the Allies in the West with, France and Belgium and Great Britain and Canada and some other people, and to the east, Russia. And really, Austria-Hungary was kind of mostly fighting on the Eastern Front, primarily fighting Russia, and also they would end up fighting Italy as well, but we're not going to get into that much rabbit hole. But the main focus here is Russia. So Russia was our ally in World War I, helping us fight Germany. Now, this gets interesting because Russia has a very long and complicated past, which we're going to dig really much deeper into in the Legends Never Die series. But for this video, just know they had a lot of people in their army, and they had not enough arms to equip them all. I mean, at one point, it was declared that the Imperial Russian Army in World War I had 1 million men without rifles. That is a problem. If you're trying to fight a war, having 1 million men walking around with no arms is really not that helpful because you still have to feed them, and they're not really able to help you. This causes a lot of logistical problems. But basically, Russia would start to look elsewhere for arms. And one of the places they would look is the United States. Now, the United States was also producing some interesting rifles for our Allied friends in World War I. They would produce, also for Russia, the Winchester 1895 lever action, and a little-known fact, they would even produce some Belgian Mausers for, you guessed it, Belgium. A lot of interesting guns, and again, we're not going to get all down the rabbit hole into that today. But one of the things the Russians wanted help with was production of the Mosin Nagant. This was their primary arm. This was their most common arm, the M91 pattern of rifle, Mosin Nagant. Originally adopted in 1891, this is their primary arm, chambered in 7.62 by 54 rimmed. And so they would look to America to help take up a little bit of the brunt of the production. Right, so if you can parallelize production, right, the Russians upped production of the Tula, Izhevsk, and Sistrayets factories in Russia, but they would also simultaneously have America producing Mosins. Now, they would have two companies produce them, the Remington factory and the New England Westinghouse factories. And that's a really interesting story that we're not going to dig too into today, but just know that those two factories produced Mosins. And these were specifically for the Imperial Russian Empire. Now, if we take a little bit of a closer look here, I'm going to zoom in so you can see this a little bit better. Whoops, sorry. Right here. This is the Imperial Russian two-headed eagle. which is actually going to come up in Legends Never Die Episode 1, which is coming up, and we'll actually talk about the origins of this, which is really fascinating. But this shows that this was for Imperial Russia. Now, what's interesting about this one, and the main topic of today's video, is the year 1918. So, the really interesting about this contract, and this is where things get really hairy, is the Bolshevik Revolution was going down in 1917. Maybe you've heard of Red October. Although, as we'll see in Legends Never Die Episode 1, it wasn't actually in October, which is a little ironic, but nonetheless, you've probably heard of it. It was basically the people rising up and overthrowing the Tsarist government and instituting... It's really complicated, but basically... ultimately, as a result of all of this, you would see Lenin rise to power in the communist state. So, in 1917, the Russians actually reneged on the contract for these Mosin Nagant rifles, which is a little bit unfortunate because it basically meant that the Remington factory and the New England Westinghouse factories would potentially go bankrupt as a result. So, this was a problem. Because what you'd have here is they set up whole factories with all the tooling and production to build these things, which cost them a fortune, right? And they're having to pay all of these workers to build these things. And now the Russians aren't going to buy them anymore. And I mean, if you look around, there's not a ton of other countries begging to buy hundreds of thousands of Mosin Nagants in World War I. And the potential few that are probably weren't really going to be able to pay for them. So this was a bad situation, guys. Now, this was in 1917. So why is this produced in 1918? Well, this is a really complicated story, as you're probably figuring out by now. But what ended up happening was the U.S. government bailed these companies out, and they would basically order a bunch of Mosins, the U.S. government would, from these two factories. But at the same time, they were still sort of making some of them, or ultimately some of them, with the intention of giving them to Russia, which is the case for this guy. So we would have this guy was actually purchased via American credits on behalf of the Imperial Russian Embassy within the United States. Now, this gets interesting because the Imperial Russian Embassy was still in America representing the, I guess you could say, government in exile that wasn't really in power anymore. This is a weird story, guys. So their Imperial Russian Embassy was still around here, and they would end up basically buying some of the American guaranteed credits in the hopes of getting these into the hands of the white Russian troops fighting the Bolsheviks. So according to one of the books I've been reading on these, and there's really not a lot of good info on these, but the one good piece of the book I found on these states that the Remington rifles produced in 1917 that had a serial number of over 600,000, okay? Because these restarted every year. So 1917, over 600,000. So above that, as well as all Remingtons produced in 1918 that we see here, were actually sent to Vladivostok in far eastern Russia. And this was to arm the Bolsheviks. Now, apparently the way they did that was they actually sent these to Vancouver, British Columbia, because that was apparently the closest port to Vladivostok. So these were produced in America, sent to Canada, then shipped over on a ship. And I'm not sure if it was all in one batch or how many batches, but these were sent over to Vladivostok. Allegedly all of them. But I can't say for certain because I need to do more research on this because I don't know if I really trust that or if that's really a universal statement. So if you've got a 1918 Remington, please send me a picture via email, because as some of the features here we're going to talk about, it's going to be useful. So apparently all of these got sent to there, and from there it gets really weird. So the Japanese were actually supposed to guard these, because these ended up just kind of sitting around at the port in Vladivostok. Now I don't know if they was at the port or if they got into like some armories there, but they were sitting around somewhere in Vladivostok. And the Japanese, who are our allies in World War I, were sort of there to help in the intervention of the Russian Civil War, quote-unquote intervention, because we didn't really do that much, unfortunately. But at any rate, they were guarding these. And so some of these actually were overrun by the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks got a hold of a lot of these. But apparently before then, I think, at least some of these, the Japanese who were supposed to guard these actually ended up selling a lot of these Remington-produced Mosins that were sitting around in Vladivostok to Chinese warlords, including one named Cheng So-lin. So you'd actually see some of these end up in Russia, in China, in the Chinese Civil War, and some of those that survived somehow got back to America, although not a lot. We would see some interesting examples, and I believe there's some in certain U.S. government operated museums or collections. So I have to do more research on that, but that's apparently what I've seen. And they have some interesting markings on them, but those probably came back from the Korean War, I guess. But what about this one that we're looking at here today? And this one appears to have more or less the same features we see on the Remington that our wonderful viewer sent me via pictures. There's two interesting things we want to look at here. Now, first of all, we can see this guy's got some pitting on him. He's serial number 9785. The first feature is going to be this little notch back here. You see this notch on the front of the chamber right here? That's not supposed to be there. So somebody actually like cut this or filed this or milled this down, however you want to put it. And so they flattened that right there. See that? Why did they do that? Well, it's a good question. Now, another interesting feature, kind of goes along with this, is this little thing right here. Okay? See these two little circles, one on each side? These little stake marks. This is a little metal insert right here. Now, if we look closer up here, we can see that our rear sight is missing, right? And we have our rear sight leaf spring right here that has broken off. Now, we can see it actually is marked Remington right here. So this is the original one. But this little piece of metal back here isn't supposed to be here. This little piece of metal is often referred to in the Mosin Nagant collectors community as a Balkan wedge. That's what you'll hear this little piece of metal referred to as. So the idea here is that you put this piece of metal back here, you stake it into place, and then you'd have your Konovalov sight, which would sit back here. In fact, I think I have one of those laying around. Here is a Konovalov rear sight. So I'm not going to assemble this, but I can kind of put it on here to show you, right, like that. What happens here is you have this slider here at the back, this guy. So if I pull these guys and I slide this all the way to the back here and place this on here, what you're going to see is that there's a little tab here on the bottom of these sliders. Now that tab is going to sit up here. See how it's going to hit this? It's actually going to rest on this wedge, this piece of metal. Now sometimes what happens is your rear sight, when that happens, it's actually the back of it right here is gonna hit your chamber area, and it's actually gonna push it up a little bit. So that's probably what happened here is they filed this down so the sight could sit down far enough like that. We can see it right there. See that? To sit like this. But this raises another good question. why do they want the sight to sit like this? Because if you do this, what actually happens is it allows you to get this at a decent sight setting. And the main reason is because whoever made this modification to their rifle didn't want this gun to be sighted with a bayonet fixed. That's the idea here. Because remember, when this gun was produced, this was produced for Imperial Russia, and Imperial Russia mandated that their guns be sighted in and shot in battle with the bayonet affixed. And so, if you don't have a bayonet affixed, your gun is going to shoot high. So, one of the things they wanted to do is lower the rear sight. Okay? And so, this would have been the normal sight setting. So, what they wanted to do is lower it to like here. Okay? And so, this is where the Balkan wedge comes into play. Is it gives you a rest here so you can sit this guy on here. That's kind of the idea. Now, we'll do another full video on the Balkan wedge because it's really interesting, and I did a rather poor job of explaining this, but that's generally the idea here, okay? Is this was to modify how the gun shoots, modify the sighting. Now, who did this? Well, this raises another good question. You could say maybe it was somewhere in the Balkans, because this is known as a Balkan wedge. This is something I'm currently researching because I try to question everything within the realm of Mosin Nagants, because it's important to really ask yourself, okay, it's commonly held that this is true, but why, right? It's easy to say one thing, but it's another thing to ask yourself why that is, or is that the case? So this is still something I'm trying to figure out for myself, figuring out if there's one particular country or era this comes from. It seems like this is a post-World War I modification. And that would make sense because, right, this gun would be used post-World War I, right? This was probably not even really used by anyone, or since we know this probably didn't get to China, this was probably overtaken and captured by the Bolshevik forces in, I think, 1920-ish, maybe like 1920 to 1922, somewhere in that time period. So it probably dates somewhere after that. Now, did this somehow get into the Balkans? I don't know. Now, our viewers, and this is the case as well, doesn't have import markings. So it's sort of a mystery, because I will see M91 Mosins that have these that also have import markings. And we can see there's no import markings here. The serial number will usually be stamped on the side of the receiver. So that makes these guns actually really interesting. Now, let me get my camera back to focus here, sorry. 1918 Remingtons are rare, made about, sorry about that. Apparently, they only made about 96,000 of them. Okay, so 96,000, sorry guys, my camera just doesn't want to work today. My camera has decided that it's the weekend and it wants to go party. Okay, so 96,000 of these. Generally, when you find a Remington Mosin, it'll be made in 1917. 1916 and 1918 Remingtons are rarer. And specifically, I believe that 1918 is the rarest year. I don't really see many of them. So if you have one like our viewer has, it's really fascinating. Really cool. And this did not come from Finland. One of the things we can confirm is this Balkan wedge here is not a Finnish modification. You don't see this on Finnish Mosins. So we know that this gun is not from Finland. So it's somewhere used in Europe, and it's still something I'm currently researching. But I wanted to make a video to help our viewer and maybe some of y'all just get a little bit better idea of what exactly these guns are and a little bit more of their interesting story, because it's one that we still don't fully understand, but it's one that needs to be told. So thank you for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed learning a little more about these interesting Remington Mosins. And I hope you're excited about our full in-depth episode with all the gory details of this stuff coming up in Legends Never Die. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Thank you guys for watching, and let me know if y'all have any prayer requests. and we'll see you next time.